Welcome to episode 76 of Lucretius Today. I am your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who's not familiar with our podcast, please check back to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any questions about those, please be sure to contact us at EpicureanFriends.com for more information. In this episode 76, we'll read approximately Latin lines 925 through 1027 of Book 5. We'll talk about the initial forms of human life on Earth and the early stages of human society. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
And therefore those who pretend that this new earth and vigorous Aether could produce such creatures as these, and support their fictions only upon the empty argument of their being new, may with the same reason put upon us other fables. They may as well tell us that golden rivers flow through the earth, that trees blossom with diamonds, that men were made with such mighty strength and bulk of limbs that they could stride with their feet over wide seas, and whirl about the body of the heavens with their hands. For though there were many seeds of things in the womb of the earth when she first began the production of living creatures, this is no rule that animals could be formed of a mixed nature and compounded of different bodies. The various products of the earth, which are in great abundance, the herbs, the fruits, and pleasant trees, never blended in such confusion together. Everything proceeds in its own proper order and preserves its distinct kind by the established laws of nature. And the first race of men were much hardier upon the earth, as 'twas fit they should, for the hard earth bore them. They were built upon larger and more solid bones, and their limbs were strained with stronger nerves. Nor did they easily feel the inclemency of heat and cold, or were affected with the strangeness of their food or any weakness of body. They led a long life of many rolling years, and wandered about like wild beasts. There was no husbandman to guide the plough, nor that knew how to cultivate the fields, none to plant young stalks in the ground, or with pruning hooks to lop the old branches from the high trees. What the sun, the rain, and the earth voluntarily produced, that bounty satisfied their grateful hearts. They commonly refreshed their bodies with acorns among the oaks, and with those wild apples which you see ripen in winter, of a red color, which the earth then bore in abundance, and of a larger size. Many other excellent fruits the new earth, fresh and in her prime, produced in great plenty for her wretched offspring. But the rivers and springs invited them to cool their thirst, as the fall of waters from the high hills call now upon the thirsty race of beasts, and wandering in the night they rested in hollow caves, the sylvan temples of the nymphs, when flowed a running stream that washed the slippery stones with its large current. Among the slippery stones covered with mossy green, it found its way, and some of its little tide broke out and spread into the plain below. As yet they knew nothing of fire to dress their foods, nor the use of skins, or how to cover their bodies with the spoils of beasts, but inhabited the groves, the hollow mountains, and the woods, and hid their naked bodies among the shrubs. This they did to avoid the rains and the blast of wind. They had no regard for the common good. They had no order among them, or the use of laws. Every man seized for his own what fortune gave into his power. Every one consulted his own safety and took care of himself. Their amours were consummated in the woods. Either the ladies were urged on by their mutual heat, or they were overcome by the superior force and raging fire of their gallants, or were softened by presents, a dish of acorns, of apples, or of choice pears. These unpolished mortals, relying on the mighty strength of their arms and the swiftness of their feet, pursued the wild beasts through the woods, with massive stones and heavy clubs. Many they hunted down. Some secured themselves in the thick brakes, when night overtook them like bristly hawks. They threw their rough bodies naked upon the ground and rolled themselves up in leaves and grass. Nor did they run howling about the fields, frightened that the day was gone and the sun was set, or wandered about in the darkness of the night, but they waited without complaint, and lay buried in soft sleep, till the sun with his rosy beams should again spread light over the heavens. For from their very infancy they had been used to observe that there was a regular succession of light and darkness, and therefore they did not think it possible. They never feared or distrusted that an eternal night could cover the earth, or that the light of the sun would never more return. But what disturbed them most was that the wild beasts often surprised and destroyed them when they were asleep. They were forced to quit their haunts, and fly out of the caverns of the rocks at the approach of the rough boar or the strong lion, and trembling in the dead of night to give up their beds of leaves to the cruel gas. And yet in those times fewer died than do now, for then the one unhappy wretch that was seized was sure to be devoured alive between their cruelties, and therefore he filled the groves, the mountains, and the woods with his cries, as he saw his reeking bowels buried in a living grave. But those who saved themselves by flight, with their bodies torn and covering their smarting wounds with trembling hands, called upon death in dreadful accents, till gnawing worms put an end to their life, for they were unskilled in medicine and ignorant what to apply to their gaping sores. But then many thousands did not fall in battle in one day. No boisterous waves dashed ships and men against the rocks. The sea then and its swelling tides raged in vain, and to no purpose, and laid aside its empty threats, and grew calm again. Nor could the deceitful flattery of its smooth waters cheat any one into the deceit, or tempt him to venture upon the smiling surface. The dangerous art of sailing was then unknown. Many then languished and died wretchedly for want of food, but now plenty is the destruction of mankind. Some then, through ignorance, would mix poison for themselves. Now they study the art and give it to others. But when they began to build huts and provide themselves with skins and fire, when one to one was joined for the life together, and the chaste sweet delights of constant love were now first felt, and they saw a lovely train of children of their own, then this hardy race first began to soften. For being used to fire, their tender bodies could not bear so well the cold of the open air, and love impaired their strength, and children by their little acts of fondness easily softened the haughty temper of their parents. Then those who lived together began to cultivate a friendship, and agreed not to hurt or injure one another. They undertook the protection of children and women, and declared by signs and broken words that the weaker should be understood as proper objects of compassion. This mutual amity, though it did not prevail among them all, yet the greater and better part kept their faith, and lived peaceably together. Otherwise the whole race of men had been soon destroyed, and the species could never have been preserved to this time.
Martin, thank you for reading that today. Before we get started, I should note that today's Father's Day in the United States, and we're missing both Charles and Don. So it'll just be Martin and I today to go over this section. And so we'll do the best we can with it. It's a little bit actually longer than some of our other selections, but I went ahead with a few more paragraphs because this one's kind of a history lesson. As much or more than it is a philosophy text. So going back to the beginning of it, I would say that first paragraph, Martin, is reinforcing your observation from the last couple of episodes that he's not seeing a lot of change within species. He's talking about the herbs, the fruits, and the pleasant trees did not blend in confusion together. Everything produces its own proper order. And as you were reading that, I was thinking, of course, and I'm sure they did this in ancient times too, that they could affirmatively mix flowers and different types of plants together to get maybe better types of plants. But he's focusing there how species breed true to their kind.
This is first paragraph he's again rejecting, so that just because there is a lot of variety, it doesn't mean that everything is possible.
Yes. I'm sure that that's the way really to defend this whole thing too, is that you certainly have some variation and change over time, and the more time you're going to have, maybe the more variation. But at the same time, you're still having a tremendous amount of regularity from generation to generation that's kept in place, and you don't just have a chaotic blend of change that takes place without a cause.
Yes, that is one thing, but the main point is actually because at that time, he's still thinking that everything was originally born by Earth. No? So yes. That means it refers to rather how the things are born. And so that means they are born in some sort of order and not in something like randomly, that things which somehow don't fit together would then produce something like chimera, which would then be able to live. No? So that one did not happen. So that is what this paragraph mainly rejects, especially these, what sometimes in those fairy tales has been described since ancient times, that some of that is just not credible enough to have happened.
Yeah, I agree with you there for sure. Now turning to what we have is line 925 today, talking about how the early men were much hardier than they are today, with larger bones, and they were used to the cold. And they lived a life of many rolling years, wandering about like wild beasts.
Yeah, and we need to keep in mind this is the mane which were produced by us. So these were not those born by previous mane, but from this. Of course, this whole idea is wrong, but still, it was this idea what is communicated there through Lucretius to us, that Epicurus apparently thought that Earth produced the first one of each species, the first ones of each species essentially. And it happened to produce enough of each species, which was then eventually continued to reproduce. And so what he uses there as characterization, that is a speculation how this very first generation of men lived. So it means it's something like Epicurus' version of Adams and Eves. So it's not just one Adam, one Eve, but many of them.
Yes. You know, as I'm listening to you and looking at these texts, I've just got finished talking about in the first paragraph how he's not spending a lot of time talking about change within species, but here he's actually talking about how there is change within humanity and that we're not as strong and hardy as we used to be, and that we can no longer bear the heat and the cold like we used to be when we were living out in nature. So I suppose if somebody were looking for change over time, this would be a paragraph here that would give some credence to that, even within Lucretius.
Yeah, but it would still not support. I don't interpret as this one anticipates Darwin's
Right.
evolution. So I see this more. From the background, these first generation were hardier simply because they were born by a hard Earth, and the following generations were born of humans. So
Right.
that means they were born of the seeds inside that first man, and that means that's why they were then softer, and that they then could no more stand the cold and heat that much. That explains is explained later because they figured out how to make it for themselves more comfortable. So this is then rather on what we are accustomed to, because if we get accustomed from early times on, we can stand extreme heat and cold more easily than now that we are relatively pampered by air conditions and heaters. So this is certainly not something what is really that much about evolution, but what we've trained our body to stand.
Sort of like Russians jumping in ice lakes and so forth. I guess it's a stereotype. We have seen pictures of people who acclimate themselves to extremes of heat and cold.
Yeah, but I think I read there elsewhere is the same thing. So, for example, I read something like at least some of the American Indians, they had the custom to throw young boys into an ice cold lake, so that they were then accustomed from young age on to cold water. And I saw them going into the cold water and even rough waters that documented later on. So when I was in British Columbia on that island there, then there was some descriptions about the American Indians living there at the time when the first settlers also lived there. And then it was described how the sons, when they came back by boat with their father towards the coast, they would get off the boat and swim through the sea. And this is quite a rough sea to swim in. And quite cold.
Yeah, interesting.
To them, this is confirmed. They were really accustomed to this cold and heat better than I would be. I mean, I was interested to swim at that time as well, but when I saw the winds there, I just didn't go into the water.
On a subject that's not entirely unrelated to that, before we started recording today, we were talking about this passage that says that they commonly refresh their bodies with acorns among the oaks. And I don't remember, I didn't get a chance to look it up and so to see if people can actually digest acorns when eating them. But I think you were telling me, Martin, that there was a frozen Neanderthal type person who was found with a bunch of acorns in their stomach.
It's not it was not Neanderthalian. It was a younger. He wasn't that old.
Okay.
It was definitely before Christ, and he was found in the Alps. No? And he had his last meal, at least if I remember it right, he had as his last meals acorns.
That's interesting. I didn't think acorns were digestible, but maybe they are. I'll have to look that up after today, although I don't plan to start eating them.
I guess that we don't eat them now is we have developed other tastes now so that we do no more eat them. No? And maybe it's really something that maybe they promote diarrhea or something like this, which then, if we can eat other foods, then we would no more take them. But they're certainly, I didn't read that they're poisonous, so they're certainly edible in some way.
I know the deer like them for some reason. Okay, well, as we begin to get into the text today about line 958, we turn to the part that's probably of most interest to people as he starts talking about the way they used to live. 958 says they had no regard for the common good and no order among them or the use of laws, and every man seized for his own what fortune gave into his power, and everyone consulted his own safety and took care of himself. One thing I think we can observe about this is that I don't think that Lucretius is really, or Epicurus were really romanticizing that state of nature as a good thing. I think most of what I'm reading here, I'm reading to be just an observation of what was, as opposed to saying that it was good or that we should go back to it or anything like that. Do you get any sense of that, Martin?
Yeah, it's not really about really should go back to that one. I don't think he means it like this. It's just a factual. Well, what he believes it would be a factual statement, which is of course it's nonsense because the first start is already wrong. No? Because men were not produced by us. And if you look in some details, some of this makes sense, but some of that just does not make sense. So this is a speculation created by starting off from the wrong premise.
Okay, so where we're going here in these next few passages, he's talking about basically an early society of basically humans that are much the same as we are today, at least physically, but just without the historic and cultural background that we have. He's saying it looks like that he's just describing how nature brought them together, it seems like.
Of course, if we just have a material world, if a new species is produced by Earth instead of by an evolution of ancestors, then of course these cannot have anything like culture or education. So he has to explain this as happened later. But if we consider now how this would happen with evolution, then we see that prehistoric man was completely different or quite different socially than what he describes here. So from what I read, that in anthropology, they pretty much guess that the first humans pretty much lived like, for example, the apes or monkeys in the savannah. So, and they have then also their method to protect the majority of them against predators. So here he basically describes that the first men were just one by one, just grabbing for himself. And this is not true. So these prehistoric men lived in communities and in tightly knit communities. And so it is assumed that they preserved themselves in a similar way like these apes or monkeys do this in the savannah. That means when they stay in the group there, then it is such that elderly people tend to fall asleep early, whereas young people stay up much later. So there are still people awake. And researchers who have observed how this works with these animals, they notice that at any time of the night, at least 10% of the clan is awake. So that means they can immediately wake up if predators are coming. I mean, of course, this is not absolutely sure. About 10% of them, as was observed, fall prey to predators, but at least the clan itself survives in this way. And it's thought that humans had the same way, because we still see today this tendency in humans that when they're younger, they prefer to stay up late, whereas older people tend to fall asleep early in the night and wake up then later in the night and do no more fall asleep. So because we have the same pattern as was observed there in those animals, it is assumed that this was formed by this first, when the race was first formed, the human race, that they lived like that for many thousand years. And this will not change that easily with just a few thousand years of subsequent evolution.
So you're saying that there's some research or well-founded opinion that as people get older and wake up in the middle of the night, that is part of maybe a protection mechanism?
Yes, apparently. Mm-hmm. At least it fits into this.
Yeah, it's certainly sort of a rotating watch period.
Yeah, and so but the main point I made from this one is that these early humans were very social. So it's not that they each grabbed by its own. They were really living as a community, and we see many examples of this even today. Because I mean, this is not demeaning now towards Africans, but because in Africa probably there's a larger percentage than everywhere else that people live still more like in this older culture, this very old culture. And that is a very community based thing. So we grow up, we tend to be rather competitive. And with the African kids, it tends to be not as extreme as it would be among us. No? So I read there recently a story. I'm not sure whether this is really proven or it's a nice invention. But then when some adult tried to give the fastest kid a reward, all the kids grabbed their hands and ran together to be together the first one, and not just a single first one to get all. No? So instead, everybody was there and they shared it.
That is interesting.
A counterexample what happens today. No? So when we have, meanwhile, this American custom, or I think maybe it was originally Irish or English, of what is in autumn, this famous Halloween. No? Then we do this trick or treat. No? And
Yes.
then one foreigner living here in Thailand, he just put a big basket full of sweets outside his door. And then one of the first kids which came just took that whole basket and filled it all in his bag and walked away with it. This is completely the opposite of the behavior of these Africans.
What would you think the Africans would do instead of taking the whole basket?
I would expect they would take a fair share, typically.
Mm-hmm. I suppose it'd be influenced by the question of if they arrived hand in hand, like you were just talking about, then it'd be more likely they would too, as if they arrived singly.
Yeah, yes, this is also the thing. They would probably come in groups, and then in addition to maybe what I would expect with their regular social behavior, there's the additional social control that nobody wants to look particularly greedy in front of friends.
Right. Well, let's move on to something else that we talked about before we got started recording today. In what we have as our passage, paragraph 970, there's a discussion of how even though they were running around in the night like bristly hogs, sleeping naked on the ground, he's also pointing out that they did not run howling around the fields, frightened that the day was gone and the sun was set, and they didn't wander about in darkness. For from their infancy they had been used to observe that there was a regular succession of light and darkness, and therefore they did not think it possible, they never feared or distrusted that an eternal night could cover the earth, or that the light of the sun would never more return. The reason I wanted to bring that out and talk about it is, seems to me that there might be a foreshadowing here of the development of religion later on, in the sense that he apparently is saying that these primitive people were not concerned that the night might come and never leave, or that the sun could never return. And I'm thinking that that would be something that eventually speculation about that might be associated with the rise of religion later on. He says, but instead what disturbed them was that the wild beasts would destroy and surprise them when they were asleep. And I'm thinking that perhaps this is a foreshadowing of, although things were not good in those primitive times, at least at that moment, we don't have religion being present among them. We're going to have that develop as we go forward. But at this point, perhaps not. They waited without complaint and lay buried in sleep till the sun with his rosy beams should again spread light over the heavens. Because here he's beginning to make this transition between just talking about them and moving on to where we are today. Because as the next paragraph comes up, he starts talking about that even so, even though the animals were devouring them, they had fewer of them, in a sense, die than we have today, when we have thousands who fall in battle at one time and shipwrecks with lots of people killed at the same time. And then the last part of that paragraph is something I've seen much comment on, how he contrasts the fact that in primitive days there was time when some through ignorance might eat something poisonous, but today we study the art of poisoning and give poison to others. What do you see in that section, Martin?
I mean, especially the last one. That is of course really and I think it's again underestimating those prehistoric humans. They certainly would have known a lot of things. So one of my previous bosses, who basically was a jungle boy from Sarawak, So he taught me a method to find out how whether food is good for you or not is to fast for a while and then have a wide selection of food available and sample of each. And this gives you a feel on what is good for you and what not. So there was definitely a lot of built up knowledge and communicated from generation to generation on what to eat, what to avoid, and so on.
Did you say that you would first fast for a while?
Yes, yes.
And what would be the point of that?
I don't know that. He just told me about this message.
Oh, okay.
And this was referring to some of the more indigenously living people there in Sarawak.
I'm not familiar with the location you're talking about. That's somewhere near Thailand?
Yeah, it's in Malaysia.
Malaysia, okay.
Yeah.
We can just now turn to the final passage today, which is an interesting discussion of the effect of children, I think would strike a lot of people as interesting here, and the sort of mellowing of humans as time went by, in the sense that people began to taste the sweet delights of constant love. And then they saw a lovely train of children of their own, and the race then began to soften. And love impaired their strength, and children, by their little acts of fondness, easily softened the haughty temper of their parents.
Yeah, again, because the first humans born of Earth would not have this first. No?
That's a good point.
But of course, there were no humans like this, so they were all born of parents. And but I think rather where this also comes from, if you look at the development of an individual, then this may be something like what an individual might be. So that when once a young man has settled with family and has children, then they tend to soften more than they used to be before.
I definitely think that's a good way of looking at it. I think that's the way most people would experience life in general, as learning these things as you go forward. And I guess that's probably reasonable that we would make that observation, because that's what he's doing, basically. He's theorizing about the original early life of humans by comparing it to what he can see himself and in the way people live around him. And I guess that would be natural that you would take the life of an individual and sort of project it back and compare how it might apply to the life of the species as a whole.
Mm. Yeah, and then in the end of the paragraph, he then basically explains how the social contract originated from this.
Right. Those who lived together began to cultivate a friendship and agreed not to hurt or injure one another, which I think is specifically what Epicurus points out in the Principal Doctrines as the basis for the agreement of justice. This is probably a very significant paragraph for somebody who wants to analyze Epicurean ethics as well, because he's talking about history as opposed to what he's saying is the optimum way of life, but he's certainly talking here about how nature led humans to undertake the protection of children and women, and to declare that the weaker should be understood as proper objects of compassion, and that even though everybody did not follow that kind of prescription, yet the greater and better part kept their faith and lived peaceably together. Otherwise, the whole race of men would have been soon destroyed, and the species could never have been preserved to this time. So you certainly have to, I think, conclude from those observations that he's thinking that nature guides humans to do that, which would have to be understood as something desirable, I would think.
Yes, and of course it makes it clear that in a completely materialistic universe, where people have their own goals for pleasure and pain, you still get guided towards following the social contract. No? So, and you don't need to put virtue on a pedestal to have this one first and derive it from there. It comes natural. Virtue comes naturally from properly looking at pleasure and pain and how to assure that we get the pleasure.
Yeah, I think you've hit on a hugely important point there. That this is the derivation of virtue in the Epicurean perspective. It doesn't come from God. It doesn't come from ideal forms. It comes from the experience of mankind over time and the guidance of, I want to say guidance of nature. I'm not sure whether that's the best thing to say or not, but to the extent that nature is establishing the way of life of all of the species that it has created, I guess you could say that this is the guidance of nature. Guidance would be the issue, I guess. Because it's not like nature looked at the situation and intelligently put together a plan. That would be the part that I think would be unacceptable in Epicurean philosophy. But if you take nature as the standard, then that's what you end up with. The text that comes to mind immediately is the one about giving thanks to nature, that she's made what's necessary easy to get. And giving thanks to nature has always been and just the whole beginning of the book about Lucretius giving thanks to Venus in the opening. It's always an interesting thing to consider what it means and to give thanks to something that did not direct any particular action towards you, because I guess most people think of thanks in terms of expressing gratitude to some other intelligent entity, which is not the foundation of what he's saying here. Most of the time when you give thanks, you're giving thanks to somebody for doing something for you. And you do it with the knowledge and the expectation that your giving thanks is going to be something that the other party receives with pleasure. But the bottom line of what you're saying here is that nature is producing this result of establishing that the species survives, at least in part, through the social contract of agreeing not to hurt each other. Otherwise, the species would not have survived. Well, why don't we begin to come to a close for today then?
I would make a link here to Plato, because Plato addresses something similar, because we see Epicurus put a lot of what he came up with in response to Plato to refute basically Plato. But in this case, I basically agree a bit more with Plato, because he was less speculative on some aspects on prehistoric Greek history than Lucretius, and through Lucretius Epicurus has been. Because Plato then, at least from what I read about it, didn't go as back to the first human produced by Earth. What I found quite interesting, so he was still aware of that the Greeks settling into Greece hundreds of years before, and before they actually had something to write it down, that there were basically the shepherd warriors. And he idealizes this being a warrior or a shepherd, or the combination thereof. And so whereas he regarded as all other manual jobs as lowly, he still put the work of a shepherd as one closely to an ideal. So what an ideal human could do, because he puts this in the context of the first tribes who settled into Greece with their warrior shepherd culture.
Martin, you've done here at the end of the podcast what we probably should have done at the very beginning, because you're exactly right. It seems like it's always one of the best ways to unwind Epicurus is to contrast him to what Plato had said previously. And I am not well read on Plato's views of the origin of the human race and so forth. Do you know what book, would someone were looking that up, do you know where it primarily exists within Plato?
I would need to read this up. The thing is, I didn't read this most. I caught a few of this in the little bit I read directly from Plato. But again, most of it, what I believe to know about Plato, I got from this Austrian philosopher Karl Popper, and he addresses Plato a lot. No? So I got this one from a book of Karl Popper on what Plato read about these ancient Greeks. No? But I found it quite interesting, so that it looked to me quite accurate what the idea of how the settlement of Greece happened. And this is impressive, because there were no written records at that time. But it was still somehow communicated on verbally from generation to generation how Greeks had lived before.
Interesting. Do you have any understanding of Plato's position on just the formation of society and so forth, sort of like we've been discussing here? Did he have or not have any statements about this sort of prehistoric period?
Yeah, he has a lot on this, but that goes now too far. I don't want to promote Plato or something. I just wanted to put the aspect that at least one point that one idea of or one way of presenting this prehistory there in Plato is more accurate than Epicurus and Lucretius, but that doesn't mean that I agree to Plato's philosophy. It's just that there he got one item right where Epicurus and Lucretius were completely off.
Well, why don't we close today basically with that thought, is that we're finding some interesting material in what we've got just right here in front of us, but we probably need to go back and at least get some kind of a basic understanding of how this might differ from what Plato had started. And since I didn't get the time to do that for today, I'll try to read a little bit more for next week. When we have Don and Charles back with us, maybe we can come back and begin to deal with sort of the bigger picture of how this might differ or be consistent with what Plato and Aristotle and others might have said about the prehistoric period. So we'll continue going on with the text as we have it and see what else we can draw out in comparison as well next week. Anything else for today, Martin?
No, I've said everything I wanted to say.
Okay, I think I've basically hit it today too. Okay, well, let's go ahead and close for today then. We'll be back next week and continue on. So thank you very much, Martin.
Yeah, thanks and bye.
Okay.